3 hours before the studio lights warmed the polished floor of NBC Burbank, before the orchestra tuned their instruments, and the audience shuffled into velvet seats with programs in their hands, Dean Martin sat quietly in the back of a black sedan and watched the California sky turn gold. Los Angeles evenings have a strange softness to them. The air carries a kind of stillness, as if the city itself pauses before nightfall. Dean had seen thousands of sunsets like this. After decades in Hollywood, the glow of twilight felt less like beauty and more like a ritual, a transition, a gentle reminder that everything bright eventually fades into shadow. He rested his elbow against the door and looked at his reflection in the window glass. The face staring back was older now, still handsome, still recognizable, but lined in places the cameras never lingered long enough to show. "This might be the last time I do this," he said softly. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror and smiled politely. "Another late one, huh?" Dean didn't answer. He didn't mean another late night. He meant something else entirely. Inside the studio, everything felt familiar, almost mechanical. Stagehands moved with precision. Assistants checked cue cards. The Tonight Show band rehearsed a playful intro riff they had played countless times before. Johnny Carson stood behind his desk reviewing his notes. He was calm, composed, exact. Carson had built his empire on rhythm, the rhythm of jokes, pauses, eye contact, silence. He understood television the way a musician understands tempo. And Dean Martin fit that rhythm effortlessly. For years, whenever Dean appeared, ratings climbed. Audiences loved him, the charm, the cool detachment, the relaxed elegance. He made it all look easy, like talent was something he carried casually in his jacket pocket. Johnny had interviewed him many times before. They understood each other in ways few performers did. Both men had mastered something invisible, the art of revealing just enough without ever exposing the core. Professional control, that was the currency of their era. When Dean stepped out of the car and into the glow of the studio lights, applause echoed even before he reached the curtain. Word travels fast backstage. When Dean Martin was in the building, energy shifted. He adjusted his tie slightly, smoothed his jacket, and walked toward the entrance. He was about to perform again. But this time, something inside him had already begun to detach. Dean Martin had spent more than 3 decades becoming a symbol. Not just a singer, not just an actor, not just a comedian. A symbol. Effortless cool, the man who never tried too hard, the man who made work look like leisure, the man who seemed untouched by pressure. But symbols are heavy things to carry, especially when the world forgets there is a human being underneath. Over the years, Dean had perfected a persona so complete that it overshadowed the private man behind it. Audiences believed in him the way they believed in myths. He was not just Dean Martin. He was a mood, a fantasy, an escape. And the more people loved that version of him, the harder it became to step outside of it. The announcer's voice boomed. "Ladies and gentlemen, Dean Martin." The curtain parted. Applause thundered. Dean walked out smiling. He always smiled. Johnny rose to greet him, hand extended. Their handshake lingered just a moment longer than usual, a silent acknowledgement between 2 veterans of the same battlefield. They sat. The cameras rolled. The familiar dance began. Johnny opened with a light joke about Dean's latest project. Dean deflected smoothly. Laughter filled the room. The audience leaned forward, delighted. Everything felt exactly as it always had. But beneath the rhythm, Dean's thoughts were quieter than usual. He wasn't focused on the next punchline. He wasn't calculating timing. He wasn't even thinking about ratings. He was listening to the sound of his own voice, trying to hear himself inside it. 7 minutes into the segment, Johnny asked what seemed like an ordinary question. "Dean, after all these years, what does it feel like walking onto a stage now?" It was the kind of question that usually invited a charming anecdote, something playful, something self-deprecating. Dean paused. "Not long, but long enough." Johnny noticed. Dean tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing with that familiar half-smile. "You know, Johnny, I've been playing a character my whole life." The audience chuckled. Dean continued. "And the funny thing is, I got so good at it, I almost forgot who I was supposed to be when the cameras turned off. The laughter grew louder. To the audience, it sounded like wit. To Johnny, it sounded like something else. Because Dean didn't look amused. He looked tired. There is a difference between telling a joke and telling the truth disguised as one. Johnny had interviewed thousands of guests, politicians hiding fear, actors masking insecurity, comedians laughing over pain. He recognized tone shifts most viewers missed. And in that moment, he sensed something fragile beneath the line. He laughed because that's what the format required. But his eyes stayed locked on Dean's, trying to read what the audience couldn't see. The segment moved forward, stories were exchanged, memories of colleagues shared, the band chimed in at just the right moments. Dean remained flawless. But something had shifted. The ease felt deliberate now. The charm slightly measured. As if each smile required intention. As if each laugh carried weight. Johnny subtly tried to circle back. "You ever think about slowing down?" he asked casually. Dean shrugged lightly. "Oh, I don't know. Maybe I'll let the character retire before I do." Again, laughter. Again, applause. Again, nobody heard the undertone. When they cut to commercial, the applause faded and the studio dimmed. Johnny didn't stand immediately. He remained seated, studying Dean as the crew adjusted lights for the next segment. Dean rose, shaking hands with the band, thanking the crew, still gracious, still composed. Still performing, even without cameras. Johnny considered saying something, asking something, but live television has its own rules. There were more guests, more segments, more jokes waiting in the wings. And men like them were not raised to ask vulnerable questions on national television. So the moment passed. That night aired like any other episode. Millions watched. Millions laughed. Millions changed channels afterward and went asleep. But Dean drove home in silence. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel energized. He felt lighter, because he had done something small but significant. He had told the truth, even if nobody recognized it. And that truth had been simple. He was tired of being Dean Martin. Not tired of music. Not tired of performing. Tired of the mask. Tired of the expectation that he would always be effortless. Tired of carrying the weight of coolness when privately he felt uncertain, aging, reflective. He wasn't collapsing. He wasn't broken. He was simply ready to stop pretending. Over the next months, invitations continued arriving. Television appearances, specials, events. He accepted fewer. Declined more. Not dramatically. Not publicly. Just quietly. A slow retreat. Friends noticed he lingered longer in silence during conversations. That he laughed less loudly. That he listened more than he spoke. But they chalked it up to maturity. Age. The natural evolution of a performer whose era was shifting. Nobody connected it to that October night. Because the performance had been perfect. Too perfect. Johnny thought about that interview often. He couldn't quite explain why it stayed with him. He had conducted hundreds of interviews. But something about Dean's phrasing lingered. "I forgot who I was supposed to be when the cameras turned off." It replayed in his mind. Not as a joke, as a confession. And Johnny understood something uncomfortable. He had built his own fortress too. Behind the desk. Behind the monologue. Behind the controlled timing. Perhaps they were both trapped in different versions of the same performance. Years would pass. Life would change. Tragedy would strike in ways nobody could predict. Dean would withdraw further. Johnny would eventually retire. But that October night remained suspended in memory. A moment when a man tried, carefully, subtly, to separate himself from his myth. And nobody reached far enough to meet him. The tragedy was not that Dean Martin stopped performing. The tragedy was that when he tried to show who he really was, the world applauded, thinking it was just another act. That is the strange cost of mastery. When you perform something long enough, people forget there is anything underneath it. And when you finally whisper the truth, it sounds like a punchline. In the months after that October appearance, nothing dramatic happened. There was no press release, no announcement, no visible break from the public rhythm that had defined Dean Martin for decades. On the surface, his life continued with the same quiet consistency it always had. Offers came in. Agents called, schedules were discussed, but something subtle had shifted inside him, and it did not shift back. The difference was not loud enough for headlines. It was internal, almost invisible, like a tide that changes direction without disturbing the shoreline. Dean had always understood the mechanics of fame. He knew that celebrity was a contract, unspoken but binding. The audience gave admiration. In return, he gave them a version of himself polished and effortless. That exchange had worked beautifully for years. It had built a career most performers only dreamed of. Yet now, sitting in his living room late at night, long after the house grew quiet, he found himself wondering what remained when the exchange stopped, when the applause faded. When the spotlight dimmed, who was left? He began declining invitations more often. At first, it was easy to justify. A scheduling conflict, a family commitment, a need for rest after touring. Industry executives assumed it was a strategic move. He's being selective, they said. He's protecting the brand. They spoke about him as if he were still entirely made of myth. But the truth was simpler and heavier. He was not protecting the brand. He was trying to protect the man underneath it. At gatherings with friends, he noticed something strange. When people laughed at his jokes, he felt detached from the sound. The laughter no longer filled him, it passed through him. The persona responded automatically, delivering charm on cue, but his inner world had grown quieter. There was no bitterness in him, no anger toward the audience or the industry. There was only fatigue, not physical fatigue, but a deeper weariness that comes from holding a pose too long. Dean Martin had mastered the art of appearing relaxed. That was part of his magic. He looked as though life never pressed too hard against him. But relaxation, when performed, is still performance. Maintaining it required discipline, awareness, restraint. He had carried that discipline for years without complaint. Now he felt the weight of it. Johnny Carson, meanwhile, continued hosting night after night with precision. Yet even he sensed that something about Dean's presence in the public sphere was thinning. It wasn't a scandal or a misstep. It was absence. Dean simply appeared less frequently, and when he did appear, there was a faint shift in energy. Johnny couldn't quite name it. The jokes still landed. The smile still flashed. But there was a softness behind the eyes that hadn't been there before, a quiet distance. Johnny thought back to that line about playing a character. It replayed in his mind more than he admitted to anyone. In the world they inhabited, authenticity was complicated. Television rewarded composure. The audience expected consistency. Breaking character was risky. It disrupted comfort. Perhaps that was why Johnny had not pursued the moment further that night. He had protected the rhythm of the show. He had done his job. But sometimes professionalism can quietly silence something human. Dean's withdrawal was not immediate. It was gradual, like a slow fade in a film. One appearance fewer this season. One tour shortened. One interview declined. The public barely noticed at first because his legacy was already secure. He had nothing left to prove. The world had already etched his name into its memory. That security gave him the freedom to step back without fear of vanishing entirely. He wasn't running from failure. He was stepping away from expectation. In private, he began rediscovering smaller things. Evenings without schedules, conversations without punchlines, silence without an audience. He listened to music without analyzing how it would sound on stage. He watched old films without measuring performance against his own. There was relief in that. Relief in not having to be on. Relief in not anticipating applause. Yet relief carried its own complexity. When you step away from a role that has defined you for decades, there is a moment of disorientation. If he was not Dean Martin, the performer, who was he? Identity does not shift overnight. It lingers, echoes, resists change. There were days when he missed the energy of live audiences. Days when he felt nostalgia for the rush of stepping into light. But nostalgia is not the same as desire. He did not want to return fully. He only wanted to understand the part of himself that existed before the myth. Friends sometimes encouraged him to do more appearances. People still love you, they would say. He knew that. The love was real, but love directed at an image can feel distant. What he longed for was something quieter, connection without performance, recognition without expectation. Johnny and Dean crossed paths occasionally at private events. Their conversations were cordial, even warm. They shared memories, laughed about old moments. But there was an unspoken understanding between them. Both men were aging. Both were beginning to contemplate life beyond the stage. Both carried personas that had become larger than their private selves. In those brief exchanges, there was mutual respect and perhaps mutual recognition. The industry interpreted Dean's retreat as natural aging. "He's earned his rest," they said, and that was true. He had earned it many times over, but the retreat was not only about age. It was about alignment. He no longer wanted to split himself into two halves, the public symbol and the private man. He wanted integration, even if it meant invisibility. Television in that era thrived on constancy. The audience tuned in expecting familiar faces, familiar tones. Dean had been one of those constants. His absence left a subtle gap. New performers rose, styles changed, comedy shifted, culture evolved. The machine of entertainment continued forward as it always does. It does not pause for individual transitions, it adapts. Dean watched that evolution from a distance. There was no resentment in him, only reflection. He understood that every era carries its own voice. He had been the voice of one chapter, it was enough. At home, he spent more time with family, more time simply being present. Presence, he discovered, required less effort than performance but more honesty. Without the protective layer of charm, emotions surfaced differently. There were regrets, yes, missed moments, sacrifices made for career, but there was also gratitude for the opportunities, for the audience, for the friendships forged in the spotlight. Johnny sometimes wondered whether he should have called Dean after that 1978 interview and asked directly what he had meant. The thought crossed his mind more than once. But timing is delicate. Men of their generation did not easily initiate vulnerable conversations. Pride and professionalism often stood in the way of emotional clarity, so the question remained unasked. Years later, when Dean's appearances became rare enough to feel final, Johnny understood something more clearly. The line about playing a character had not been dramatic. It had not been a cry for help. It had been a statement of awareness. Dean had recognized that the persona had grown larger than the man, and he had chosen, quietly, to step out from beneath it. There is courage in loud declarations, but there is a different kind of courage in quiet departure. Dean did not dismantle his myth publicly. He did not criticize fame or reject his legacy. He simply loosened his grip on it. That subtle act required strength. As his public presence thinned, stories about him grew more nostalgic. Media began referring to him as a legend rather than a current figure. Tribute pieces appeared, retrospectives aired. Ironically, the less he appeared, the more mythic he became. Absence has a way of polishing memory. Yet in the privacy of his own life, he felt something simpler than legend. He felt human. He was no longer required to be effortlessly cool. He could be reflective, he could be uncertain, he could age without applause. Johnny eventually began contemplating his own retirement. Night after night behind the desk had shaped his identity as much as singing and film had shaped Dean's. He recognized the same tension, the challenge of separating the host from the man. When he finally chose to step away years later, perhaps he remembered Dean's quiet withdrawal and understood it differently. The slow disappearance was not tragic. It was deliberate. It was not collapse. It was clarity. Dean Martin did not fade because the world rejected him. He faded because he no longer needed to be illuminated by it. Looking back, that October night on The Tonight Show feels less like a single moment and more like a hinge. A turning point so subtle that it passed unnoticed. The joke that wasn't a joke. The smile that held something deeper. The pause that signaled reflection. In the end, the slow disappearance was an act of self-preservation. After years of giving the world a carefully crafted version of himself, Dean chose to reclaim the rest. And in doing so, he demonstrated a quiet resilience, the kind that does not demand recognition. He did not rage against fame. He did not condemn the industry. He simply stepped back into himself. And sometimes that is the bravest performance of all, the one that happens when the cameras are off, the applause has stopped, and a person decides that being human is enough. Silence has a strange texture to it, especially for men who built their lives around sound. For decades, Dean Martin had lived inside applause, orchestras, laughter, and the low hum of studio lights. Johnny Carson had lived inside monologues, punchlines, the rhythm of cue cards flipping in perfect order. Noise had been their currency. But as the years passed and Dean retreated further from public view, what remained between them was not noise. It was silence. Silence, when chosen, can feel peaceful. Silence, when misunderstood, can feel heavy. Dean's silence was not a protest, nor was it bitterness. It was introspection. It was the quiet recalibration of a man who had spent most of his adult life narrating himself for others. Without the demand to narrate, he began noticing parts of himself that had long been overshadowed. He noticed how deeply he valued stillness. He noticed how rarely he had allowed himself to feel openly vulnerable without diffusing it through humor. He noticed that the persona he had crafted, smooth, unbothered, permanently relaxed, had once served him brilliantly, but now felt like clothing that no longer fit. Johnny, meanwhile, remained at his desk night after night, doing what he had always done best. Yet even as he continued hosting, he began recognizing something subtle within himself as well. Interviews felt different as he aged. The stakes shifted. When younger performers sat across from him, full of ambition and confidence, he saw reflections of an earlier era, one in which he and Dean had dominated cultural space. But when he thought of Dean specifically, what returned to him was not a joke, not a story, not a ratings spike. It was that pause, that fraction of a second when Dean's smile seemed to soften into something more reflective. There are conversations that happen in words, and there are conversations that happen in glances. That night in 1978, something unspoken passed between them. Johnny sensed it but did not pursue it. Dean offered it but did not expand it. Neither man crossed the invisible boundary that separated professional performance from personal confession. In that era, such boundaries were rarely crossed publicly. Even privately, they required courage that many men were never taught to exercise. Strength was defined as control. Control meant maintaining composure. Composure meant continuing the show. The weight of silence grew more noticeable in the years that followed. As Dean appeared less frequently, speculation naturally surfaced in industry circles, but it was always shallow. He's slowing down. He's enjoying retirement. He's selective now. These explanations were comfortable because they were simple. Few considered the emotional complexity of stepping away from a persona that had shaped one's entire identity. To dismantle a myth is not merely to change schedules. It is to renegotiate the self. Dean's closest companions noticed shifts. He lingered in conversations longer without filling gaps with humor. He sometimes listened without responding immediately, as though measuring words differently than before. He had always been thoughtful beneath the charm, but now that thoughtfulness surfaced more plainly. He did not seem unhappy. He seemed contemplative. The difference was important. Johnny occasionally replayed old footage in his mind. In his later years, reflection came more easily. Hosting thousands of interviews had given him a unique vantage point on human behavior. He had seen bravado collapse into vulnerability, watched comedians use humor as armor, witnessed powerful figures reveal quiet insecurities under studio lights. Yet what unsettled him about Dean's moment was its subtlety. It had not been dramatic. It had not been desperate. It had been precise, almost surgical. A single sentence slipped between jokes. "I've been playing a character my whole life." It was not self-pity, it was awareness, and awareness can be isolating. Silence between them was not hostile, it was incomplete. Both men understood performance intimately. Both had benefited from mastering it, but neither had openly discussed its cost. There is a loneliness in being widely admired. Admiration focuses on output, not interior life. Audiences fall in love with consistency. They rely on it. If Dean had suddenly abandoned the smooth persona that defined him, the audience might have felt disoriented, perhaps even disappointed. He understood that. That understanding made authenticity complicated. Over time, as cultural expectations evolved, public conversations about identity and vulnerability became more common. But in the late 1970s and early 1980s, emotional transparency among male entertainers was rare, particularly on national television. Professionalism was prized above confession. To deviate too far from composure risked undermining authority. Johnny himself embodied that balance, personable but controlled, humorous yet guarded. He did not reveal more than he intended. That restraint had built his credibility. Yet restraint can also prevent connection at the deepest level. The conversation that never happened between Dean and Johnny lingered as a quiet echo. It was not a missed opportunity born of indifference. It was born of habit. Habit shaped by decades of maintaining the show. As Dean's public presence thinned further, his private life grew more central. He spent time reflecting on legacy. Legacy, he realized, is often defined by others. The public catalogs achievements. The media recounts milestones, but personal legacy is quieter. It resides in relationships, in moments not televised, in conversations not recorded. He began prioritizing those. When tragedy later struck in his life, it deepened the withdrawal, but the foundation had already been laid. He had already begun separating the man from the myth. Grief simply accelerated a process that had started years earlier. The world interpreted his retreat through the lens of loss, and while that interpretation was partially true, it overlooked the earlier shift, the earlier awareness, the earlier fatigue. Johnny, in his own later years, confronted similar questions about identity. When he contemplated stepping away from the desk, he felt the tremor of uncertainty. Who was he without the nightly ritual, without the audience waiting, without the structure of jokes and interviews anchoring his days? In that sense, he and Dean were bound by parallel experiences. Both had been symbols, both had become institutions, and institutions rarely admit vulnerability easily. The weight of silence between them was not regret in the conventional sense. It was recognition delayed. Johnny came to understand that Dean's comment had been an act of honesty delivered within the only framework available to him at the time: humor. Humor had always been Dean's safest channel. It allowed truth to slip through without triggering discomfort, but humor can also dilute impact. When the audience laughs, the urgency dissipates. If Johnny had leaned forward that night and asked, "What do you mean by that?" the show would have shifted tone. It would have disrupted expectation. Perhaps Dean would have expanded. Perhaps he would have retreated further into performance. There is no certainty. What remains certain is that both men continued operating within the boundaries that had made them successful. Success can become its own constraint. As years passed and both entered the quieter chapters of their lives, their paths occasionally crossed at private gatherings. The conversations were polite, respectful, warm, yet neither revisited the 1978 moment explicitly. Maybe they did not need to. Maybe understanding had settled between them silently. Sometimes acknowledgement does not require articulation. Dean's legacy endured regardless of his withdrawal. Music remained. Film remained. Stories remained. Yet beneath the preservation of the myth, there was a quieter truth. He had reclaimed something essential by stepping back. He had chosen interior clarity over exterior applause. That choice did not make headlines, but it mattered profoundly to him. Johnny's later reflections on his career carried a similar tone. When he eventually left television, he did so without spectacle. His farewell was dignified, controlled, measured. He too stepped into silence after decades of noise. And perhaps in that silence, he understood Dean more completely than he ever had under studio lights. The conversations that never happened are not always tragedies. Sometimes they are simply products of timing. Both men were shaped by an era that equated strength with composure. They honored that code faithfully. But within that code, there were moments, like that October pause, when deeper truths tried to surface. The weight of silence, in the end, was not a burden carried in bitterness. It was a reminder of the complexity of public life. Dean Martin did not collapse under fame. He navigated it deliberately. Johnny Carson did not ignore vulnerability. He respected the structure of his craft. Both were professionals in a system that rewarded polish. What makes that 1978 exchange endure is not scandal or drama. It is subtlety. It is the realization that sometimes the most honest statements arrive wrapped in humor, and the most significant goodbyes sound like punchlines. The audience laughed, the band played, the cameras moved on. But beneath it all, a man had quietly signaled that he was ready to be more than the character he had perfected. The world did not notice immediately. It rarely does. But silence has a way of revealing what noise obscures. And in the quiet that followed, both men, separately, came to understand the cost and the courage of stepping beyond performance. By the early 1990s, the world around Dean Martin and Johnny Carson had changed dramatically. Television was louder, faster, more exposed. A new generation of performers embraced confessional interviews and emotional openness that would have felt almost foreign in the era when Dean first rose to prominence. Audiences were beginning to expect vulnerability from their stars, not just polish. Ironically, the kind of truth Dean had slipped quietly into a joke years earlier was becoming more acceptable in public conversation. But timing shapes impact, and in 1978, his moment had floated past unnoticed. Dean had long since withdrawn into a life of privacy. The cameras no longer waited for him. The invitations had slowed. The myth, however, remained intact. If anything, distance had strengthened it. Nostalgia has a way of softening edges and amplifying glamour. To the public, Dean Martin was still the effortless crooner, the smooth presence who made everything look easy. The retreat only reinforced the legend. What most people never saw was the intentionality behind that retreat. He had not been pushed out, he had stepped away. There is something powerful about choosing obscurity after decades of visibility. It requires a different kind of strength. The spotlight can become addictive not because of ego, but because it creates structure. It gives life rhythm. Without it, days feel longer, quieter, less defined. Dean accepted that quiet deliberately. In that quiet, he found something steadier than applause, self-recognition. Johnny, too, was nearing the end of his long tenure on The Tonight Show. After 30 years behind the desk, he understood that stepping away would reshape his identity in ways he could not fully anticipate. When he finally announced his retirement in 1992, it was done with the same measured composure that had defined his entire career. There was gratitude, there was dignity, there was no spectacle. And perhaps in that final stretch of episodes, he understood more deeply what Dean had begun to feel years earlier. In his final weeks as host, Johnny reflected on guests who had shaped the show's history. Dean Martin's name naturally surfaced among them. Johnny spoke warmly of his talent, his professionalism, his ability to make live television look effortless. What he did not say, but may have felt, was that Dean had also taught him something quieter. That mastery of performance carries hidden weight. The two men saw each other occasionally at private events during those later years. Age had softened them both. There was less urgency in their voices, less need to impress. They spoke as contemporaries who had survived the same cultural storms. They did not revisit the specific moment in 1978. They did not dissect the joke that wasn't a joke. Perhaps they did not need to. Some understandings settle without discussion. There is a kind of peace that comes from recognizing shared experience without forcing it into words. As Dean's health declined in the mid-1990s, the public once again turned its attention toward him, but now through the lens of legacy. Tributes circulated, retrospectives aired. Journalists revisited old footage, replaying interviews and performances that had once seemed routine. When viewers returned to that October 1978 Tonight Show appearance with hindsight, the pause became visible. The smile seemed more deliberate. The sentence about playing a character resonated differently. What had sounded like self-aware humor now felt like quiet confession. Dean Martin passed away on Christmas Day in 1995. The timing itself felt poetic, almost cinematic. Obituaries celebrated his voice, his partnership with Jerry Lewis, his Rat Pack years, his cultural imprint. They praised his ease, his style, his charm, and all of that was true. Yet beneath those tributes lay an unspoken dimension, the courage it took to step away from the myth he had built. Johnny Carson lived another decade beyond Dean's passing. In those years, he remained largely private, enjoying life outside the relentless structure of television. Without the nightly spotlight, he too existed without performance. Perhaps in that space, he reflected on the arc of his own career with greater clarity. Perhaps he revisited moments that had lingered quietly in memory. That October night may have been one of them. It is easy to romanticize the idea of a dramatic farewell, a speech that announces finality. But Dean's goodbye was not dramatic. It was gradual. It unfolded in small decisions, in fewer appearances, in shorter tour, in quieter evenings. The line he delivered to Johnny was not an announcement of retirement. It was an acknowledgement of identity. He had played the role so convincingly that even he had nearly forgotten where the role ended. The real goodbye was not to television. It was to the version of himself constructed for public comfort. And by letting that version fade gently rather than shattering it publicly, he preserved both dignity and truth. He did not expose bitterness. He did not dismantle the myth angrily. He simply loosened his hold on it. The lesson embedded in that moment extends beyond celebrity. It speaks to anyone who has ever felt trapped inside expectations they helped create. It speaks to professionals who build reputations so solid that they become cages. It speaks to the quiet exhaustion that can arise from constant composure. Dean Martin's story reminds us that stepping back can be as meaningful as stepping forward. Johnny's eventual retirement mirrored that realization. After decades of guiding conversation, he stepped away without seeking reinvention. He did not attempt to replace the desk with another spotlight. He accepted stillness. And perhaps that stillness felt less foreign because he had already witnessed what it looked like in Dean. The 1978 interview remains preserved in archives, unchanged by time. Viewers who discover it now bring new context. They see two masters of performance sharing a subtle exchange beneath the surface of entertainment. They see professionalism layered over reflection. They see the complexity of public identity. What makes that moment endure is not scandal or revelation. It is humanity. It is the realization that even icons carry invisible weight. It is the understanding that sometimes truth emerges quietly, disguised in humor because humor feels safer. It is the recognition that not every goodbye is loud enough to hear in real time. Dean Martin's legacy did not diminish because he withdrew. It deepened. The myth remains, but so does the man who chose to reclaim himself beneath it. Johnny Carson's legacy also remains, defined by control, wit, and cultural influence. Yet within that legacy sits a quieter understanding that the most important conversations are sometimes the ones almost spoken. When we look back at that October evening now, we do not see failure. We see transition. We see awareness dawning in real time. We see a performer gently untethering himself from expectation while maintaining grace. We see another performer recognizing something deeper but honoring the format that shaped them both. The goodbye nobody heard was not tragic. It was subtle, and subtle moments often carry the most lasting resonance. Dean Martin did not need a final bow under bright lights. His final bow began the moment he allowed himself to acknowledge that the character and the man were not the same. From that acknowledgement flowed every quiet step away from the stage. In the end, what remains is not regret but recognition. Recognition that performance, no matter how brilliant, is not the whole story. Recognition that stepping back can be an act of courage. Recognition that sometimes the most powerful truths arrive softly, carried on a smile, disguised as a joke, waiting for someone to notice. The world laughed that night in 1978, unaware that it had just witnessed a turning point. But time has a way of revealing what applause once concealed. And in that revelation we find not sadness, but respect, for a man who understood when it was time to let the character rest, and for the quiet strength it took to say goodbye without saying it at all.